let's go to the board and see how it looks like. So here on the board, we have our jacket. That's how it looks like. It's a lady's jacket. We have some little styling here with the buttons on top of it and short sleeves. That's how it's going to look like after we finish making it. And on this side of the board, you can see that we have our front pattern here. Just like we did for our simple blouse or princess cuts, we're going to have a front pattern, a back pattern. So this is our front pattern, after which we will now make the back pattern. So let's consider the measurements we'll use for this lady's jacket. So here are the measurements that we're going to use to make our lady's jacket. And of course, these are my measurements, so I'm your model for today. Now we're going to begin to work on these measurements. The shoulder measurement, we have to subtract ½ an inch from it because we want the sleeves to sit well on and hang well from the shoulders, so we would not just use it as an exact shoulder measurement. We will subtract ½ an inch. So we'll take that out there. So this will give us 14½. Our bust measurement, we'll divide that into 4. That will give us 9½ inches. We'll divide the waist into 4. That's giving us 8½ inches. The hips measurement, we'll divide that into 4. This will give us 10½ inches. Our shoulder to bust is 11½ inches. Shoulder to waist, 16 inches. The bust span is 7 inches, so we divide that into 2. That will give us 3½ inches. The neckline width, will also divide that into 2. That will give us 2 3/4. The armhole depth, we'll leave it like that. The sleeve length, 7 inches. We'll add ½ inch at the top here, and then we'll add 1 inch at the base. So that will be plus ½ plus 1, and that gives us 8½ inches. The sleeve width, will divide that into 2, and that will give us 6 plus ½ inch seam allowance. That's 6½ inches. So we're going to start by making the front pattern first. Okay. So the first thing we'll do will be to mark out our lapel edge. And that's the extra that comes down here, so we'll mark it out. We'll measure it as 1½ inches. We can use more than that if you desire. If you want to make the lapel wider, it's really up to you, but let's make use of 1½ inches. So we'll measure 1½ inches here, and then mark it all the way down. Just clean that very well. Okay, and after I've marked out my lapel edge, I'll mark out my buttonhole allowance, which is very important. That will be 1 inch. After I've marked out my lapel edge and my buttonhole allowance, I'll now begin to mark out my measurements. So my shoulder, I divide that into 2. That will give me 7 1/4. So I measure 7 1/4 here. And I immediately measure out my neckline width, which is 2 3/4. Just like making a shirt, so it should be close to the neck. I now mark out my shoulder slant, which is 1½ inches. Slant that to that point there. Now draw this line down for my armhole. My armhole depth is 7½ inches, so I'm using 7½ inches for my armhole depth. I'll mark that out here and draw the line through that point. On that line, we'll measure out our bust measurement. Our bust measurement is 9½ inches. That's 9½ inches there. So now, for the length of this, now remember that we're making a lady's jacket and we're trying to observe some of the rules of making a suit, but not necessarily all the rules. So one of the things that we're going to observe here is the position of the dent. Now the position of the dent is not going to be the midpoint as usual. It's going to be 2/3 of the way. That means we're going to divide our armhole depth into two and use 2 points of that, 2 parts of that. That means that this is 7.5 inches. I divide that into 3. That will give me 2.5. I now multiply that by 2. That will give me 5. So 5 inches is 2/3 of 7.5 inches. So I'll mark 5 inches down somewhere here. And then I would mark out my dent. This time around, my dent is going to go inward much more than the normal 1 inch we use. We're going to make it 1.5 inches. For the suit, normally it's deeper than that, but we're going to use 1.5 inches. So we use 1.5 inches. That will come in here. So let's remove that. This is 5. So I now use my ruler to mark it down to that point there. Then, of course, from there, I now curve. You can see that it's deeper. It's set in properly because we need to take off all the excess as much as possible and make our suit sit well. All right? So after I've done that, I'll measure out my shoulder to bust. My shoulder to bust is 11.5 inches. That should be somewhere here. On that line, you replicate the 9.5 inches for the bust. Draw the line down that way. On this bust line, we will now measure out our bust span, that is 3.5 inches, somewhere here. So from this point here where we have our dent, we now curve it down to that point. You can see that. Good. Then immediately I draw out my line here. Now, this is the dent. I can use as much as 2 inches or 2.5 inches. But because I want it to sit well, I'll use 2.5 inches for my dent. This is where it will be here. 2.5 inches is fine. So I now curve it back to that point. You can see that. I'll now measure this point here, this curve that is here. I replicate the same measurement somewhere here. Let's assume it's here. Measure out my 1 inch downwards. That's 1 inch there. I'll now curve it to that point. Because, you know, we're going to close this back up, so we want it to, you know, have enough space so that it can come back to our original 7 inches for our armhole depth. So I take this all the way down, my 3.5 inches. This is 3.5 inches. And I measure my shoulder to waist and the length of the blouse. Shoulder to waist is 16 inches. I measure that out, so we're here. And the length of the blouse, we didn't put that there, the length. For the length, we'll use 24 inches. So we'll measure that down here, from here to here, that's 24 inches. So on this length, we'll now come back here to the middle, mark out our darts here, half and half. You just take that there, and you take this here, and you come back here and take it all the way down. Then we now come back to the waist. Now that what I'm left here with is 3 inches. So the waist is 8.5 inches. If I subtract 3 inches from that, I'll have 5.5 inches left. So I have 5.5 inches here. So you can see that. Now look at this. We have 3 here, we have 5.5, that's 8.5 inches. Obviously by the time you're done, this will just be like a straight line. So it's somewhere here. That's what happens when you have a big stomach like mine. So you find that you don't really have so much of a shape on your pattern, but it doesn't matter. By the time we take out the darts and we sew it together, we'll see the shape come out. So at the base here, I'll measure out the hips. The hips is 10.5 inches. That should be somewhere here. This is from here. This is my 10.5 inches. I now curve that, 10.5. I curve that to that place there. Good. So we can see that we've already done that. It's going to have a straight edge at that point there. Now come back to my lapel, my collar region. Now, I want my lapel to end at my waistline. So what I would do would be that I would take the measurement of my shoulder to waist, which is 16 inches. I'll divide that into 3. Now, obviously, you know, because this is 16 inches, it might be like 15 1/4, thereabout. Let's just take, I mean, it will be like 5 1/4. So I'll just take 5 inches as 1/3 of my distance. That's the shoulder to waist. That's the distance that I want my lapel to end. But if I want my lapel to end shorter than that, all I just need to do is, if I want it to be, for instance, 9 inches, I want my lapel to fold out up to 9 inches, I just divide that into 3, take 1/3, and I use it. So that's how it works. So because my waist is 16 inches, I will divide that into 3. I'll just approximately use 5 inches for that. So I come here to the top here, measure out 5 inches, and I come here and curve it to that point there. You can see that? This is 5 inches. And I come to this point that where my waist is on the buttonhole allowance. Now don't forget that the buttonhole allowance is part of your pattern. What is not totally part of everything is your lapel edge. So we'll curve from the lapel edge here to where the waistline is on the buttonhole. So I just curve there. I just come down like about 2 inches down and curve it from there. I want it to move, to have a very nice curve to that point. Yeah. So we're done with our front pattern. Let's take a look at our back pattern. So the first thing we're going to do on our back pattern will be to measure out our shoulder measurement directly. That's our shoulder measurement. That's 7 1/4. Our neckline width is 2 3/4 inches. So I'll mark that out there. Come here, measure my 1.5 inches. And connect that there. My neckline depth for the back will be 1/2 inch because it's just like I'm going to make a collar, so I don't need it to be too deep. So I'm using 1/2 inch. That's 1/2 inch, and then we curve it up to the top like that. Good. So now we want to work out our armhole. My armhole is 7.5 inches. That's what I'm using. So I mark out 7.5 inches here. Draw the line through that point. On that line, I measure out my bust. My bust is 9.5 inches. I get the midpoint. This time around, I'm going to use the midpoint. That means that I'm going to use 3 3/4. And I mark inward 1/2 inch for my dent. Now connect it there and curve it there. Good. So I now measure out my shoulder to bust, shoulder to waist, and the length of the blouse. My shoulder to bust is here. Shoulder to bust is 11.5. Waist. Now for the waist, we are going to reduce the waist for the back by 1/2 inch. Now you'll notice that the back is slightly shorter than the front. So for a jacket, it's very important that we take note of that. So we're going to subtract 1/2 inch from our shoulder to waist for the back. And that will give us 15.5 inches. So I now measure the length of my blouse. The length of my blouse is 24 inches. So this is where it is. 24. That's where the measurement is. So I now replicate this measurement on my bust line here. Draw the line. Then remember how it is on our simple blouse. We come to the armhole line here. We divide it exactly into 2 because there's no bust at the back. So we're going to divide that exactly into 2. And what we're going to have is 4 3/4 because this is 9.5. So we're going to have exactly 4 3/4 here. That's 4 3/4. And then you just curve it there to that point. Then you draw the line all the way down. Good. So once I've done that, I come to this point here. Now because of the curve of the back, I told you that this is a lady's jacket, so we're going to be observing some of the rules of making a suit. I'll come here to the exact middle here, the center back here, and I would take in 3/4 of an inch. Just 3/4 of an inch. It's also like a dart. It's just for it to take, to curve around the back of the jacket. I'll now come here, 4 inches down here, 4 inches, and I'll now take my ruler and draw that down to where, don't mind my my strokes there. Just take it down to that point. When we get to the pattern paper, it will be straight. Okay? After I've done that, I now take it back to the base here. You can see that that's like a very big dart. You can see that? So once I've done that, what I'm left with here is 4 inches, but I'm still going to take some darts here. I'll take 1/4 of an inch on both sides. Rather than taking 1/2 an inch, I'll take 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 here, and 1/4 there. I slant it from the top here with my ruler. Slant it there. Okay, so now what we're left with here is 3/3/4, because this is a 3/4 here, this is a 1/4 here, and what's left here is 3/3/4. Now, I want to balance up my waist here, so this is it. I'm going to subtract 3/3/4 from 8, and what I would have left should be 4/3/4. That's 3 plus 4. 3 plus 4 is 7. 3/4 plus 3/4 is 1.5. So that means I get my 8.5 inches. So I'm going to have 4/3/4 here. I'll now mark out that position there and connect it down. And I'll measure out my hip measurement, which is 10.5 inches. Somewhere here, and I'll curve it out. So that's my back pattern. So let's take a look at how we're going to make the sleeves. We have here our sleeve length is 8.5 inches, and our sleeve width is 6.5 inches. The armhole depth we're using is 7.5 inches. Now, because of the way we're going to fit in the sleeve, we're going to ease it in. That means we're going to have a slight gather at the top of the sleeve. Very slight, you wouldn't even notice it. So we're going to add an extra inch. Instead of adding 1/2 inch, we're going to add an extra inch as the seam allowance, because we're incorporating the easing in off the crown of the sleeve. So instead of using 7.5 plus 1/2, we're going to make it 7.5 plus 1. So I'll take that here. I'll draw my rectangle. So I come here, measure out my armhole depth. I add 1 inch here. That will give me 8.5 inches. This is where it is. I draw the line. Measure out the length of my sleeve. The length of my sleeve is 8.5 inches. You can see it's a square now. That's 8.5. Draw the line down. Good. So after I've done that, I now mark out my sleeve boxes. I'm going to be using 3 inches each for my sleeve boxes, because now I want my sleeve to fit very well along my armhole. So I'll measure out 3 inches here and 3 inches here. Take it down. And I'll get the midpoint here. So I label A, B, C, and D. So I curve from here to the intersection here, and I curve here. So that's my sleeve. And I'll get to this point now, measure out my sleeve width. My sleeve width is 6.5 inches. So that's the sleeve. We've already gotten our sleeve now. So now that we have done all our patterns and we've illustrated them, we'll now go to the table and now begin to draft our patterns. So we're going to start with our front pattern. Start measuring out our lapel edge. Lapel is 1.5 inches. Now we'll measure out our buttonhole allowance, 1 inch. So I'll measure out my shoulder. Shoulder is 7 1/4. Neckline width is 2 3/4. And your shoulder slant, 1.5 inches. You draw for the line for the armhole. Now measure out 7.5 inches. On that line, that's the bust. I'll measure out 9.5. Then 2/3 of my armhole for the position of my dent, that's 5 inches. Now mark in 1.5 inches. Immediately I'll draw the line for my suppression gap. I'll use 2.5 inches. So now curve it. Okay, so we now measure out our shoulder to bust, shoulder to waist, and the length of our jacket. Shoulder to bust, 11.5, shoulder to waist, 16, and the length of the jacket is 24 inches. Eleven and a half, 16, 24. So I'll mark out my bust measurement here. That's 9.5. On this line, I mark out my bust span, which is 3.5 inches. I immediately curve that here. And I'll curve this one here. So now measure out the curve here and transfer it here. That's 5.5 inches. Transfer it here. Now measure out 1 inch down here and curve to that point. You can see that we've already gotten out our new bust point here. So I'll measure out 3.5 inches, which is the bust span, all the way down. And on the waist, I measure out my darts. So what I'm left here with is 3 inches. I need to measure 5.5 to make up my waist. I told you it's just like straight. So I'll now measure my hip measurement here, which is 10.5 inches. So I come back to this point here, measure out 5 inches for my neckline depth for the front. Now curve that there. I come to the waistline here. Now I'll begin to curve it to that point. Okay, so we've gotten our curve there now. So now let's draw a line and make our back pattern. This is the front pattern here, so we now make the back pattern. I come to the top, measure out my shoulder, 7 1/4 inches. My neckline width, 2 3/4. Shoulder slant, 1.5. ½ inch for my neckline depth at the back. Draw my armhole. Seven and a half inches. I get my midpoint there. That's 3 3/4 inches. Measuring ½ inch. And my bust measurement here, 9.5. Good. So I measure out my shoulder to bust, shoulder to waist, and the length of the blouse. Don't forget we subtracted ½ inch from the shoulder to waist. So that means our shoulder to waist will now be 15.5 inches. So we measure 11.5, 15.5, and 24. Same here. 11.5, 15.5, and 24. So I measure my bust measurement here, 9.5 inches. Draw the line. I come to my armhole level here and divide my bust directly into 2. That will be 4 3/4. So I just curve this to meet this here. You can see the very slight slant. I measure 4 3/4 here also. So I come here to the back here, the waistline here. I measure 3/4 of an inch here. And I come here, measure 4 inches. That's the top here. I'll draw the line. So I come here, measure my 1/4 of an inch on either side. So I measure what is left here. What is left here is 3 3/4. So I need to balance it up here. I need like 4 3/4 here. So you can see it comes out gently. And then on the hip, I measure out my 10.5 inches. So it shoots out slightly, so all I will do, I'll just increase my bust gently, because if you look at this place here, you will see that we already have eaten in here. Look at this place here. We've eaten into like about 1/2 inch, so we'll just shift it out here by an extra 1/2 inch. So this will now become straight. Once you've taken this part here, there's a need for you to shift it here. And then you now curve it here. Okay, so we've done our front pattern, our back pattern. What's left for us to do now is our sleeve. So I'll draw the line here. And I'll measure out my armhole depth. My armhole depth is 7.5 plus 1. That will give me like 8.5 inches. Measure that on the other side. So, and I'll measure out the length of my sleeve. Length of my sleeve is also 8.5 inches. So I measure up my slip boxes. I'm using 3 inches each. And my midpoint here is 4 1/4. So I have A, B, C, D. So I start my curve from here, going into the intersection there. And I'll come out here. My 6.5 inches. So now we've made out our patterns, the front pattern, the back pattern, and our sleeve. So we'll cut them all out now. And when we're cutting out the princess cut on this side, we'll just add extra 1 inch to make up for it. Now you can see that we have some space here. I won't cut that out. Now that will help to augment the difference that we have removed here, so that by the time we place it here, it just balances up. You can see that. So you can always do that just to balance it up. Once you just take out that 1 inch here, you just add another extra inch to this base so that it will just balance. So by the time you place it on your back piece, it balances out. You can see that. So always remember to do that. I'll also leave this one here just in case, so that if, for instance, I need to trim that off, I can trim it off later. But I will leave this 1 inch here also, so that it can also balance up. But if we have any excess, we'll trim that off. We have our pieces here. So we've cut out the pieces now. So we're going to pick our material and then cut it out. So this is the fabric we're going to use to make our jacket. I'm sure you like it. I like it too. So, and this is the lining. So I'm going to open it out. Now I'm going to have to cut them piece by piece. So I'll start with the front. We'll leave enough for the seam allowances. Now for this front piece, we're going to cut 4 pieces. That means that we'll need to have 4 different pieces of this. We're not cutting out lining for it. The fabric will also be the lining for that portion. We'll cut the lining of this princess cut side anyway. So we'll put this aside. We'll cut out another piece of this. So I'll fold this for my back pieces. Put this here. No. We'll now begin to cut out the lining. Change the direction. So I've cut this now. Put that aside. So the remaining pieces we have here, we'll place them on top of lining and we'll cut them out. So I'll pick my sleeve. So I'll pick my sleeve pattern now. I'll now cut it out. So I'll now fold my lining also. So we'll notch the two ends here. So now we've cut out all our pieces. We're now going to iron out our hairstay, fuse it onto it, and then we'll begin to sew. So now I'm going to start sewing my princess cut. We've already ironed the hairstay now, so I'll start sewing it from the right hand side. You notch the waistline. And you notch the princess cut side here. So the second one, you can see that we don't really have much distance there, so notch the waist. So we join the back. So we take the right side, So we join the shoulders and the sides. We have to trim off slightly from the front sides. Just take a little from the armhole. We'll notch the waist. So we'll pick the lining and we'll join it the same way. This is our front princess cut. Join the backs. Join the back princess cut. So we join the second side. So now we'll go to the ironing table to press open the seams. So we're going to press open all the seams now. So we're ironing the lining. Okay, good. So I will start by trimming the edge of my jacket first. Before I trim the lining, I can see that we have some little excesses here. So we'll take that off. I'll take off the little excess in front here. The little excess in front here too. So we're done with that. Now, I'll also trim up the excesses from the lining before I now take off 1 inch. Okay, I'll put the 2 edges together to be sure it's the same. Okay, I have like a little excess here. So I'll now trim off 1 inch from the base of the lining. The reason why we're trimming off 1 inch is because it's a straight edge, but if it was a curved edge, we only trim off 3/4. All right, so now we've already trimmed that. We'll put this aside. I have also ironed out the styling I want to put that's the belt-like style I want to put on the mid-waist here. So what I would do is stretch this out. Now, the measurement from the base to my waist is 9 inches. 9 inches is the measurement from my waist to the base. So what I would do is, I need to centralize this band in between that. And if you check this is 2 inches. So if I centralize that, it will have 1 inch up, 1 inch down. So I would place it about 8 inches above the base. So that will give me a centralization. So I've already ironed the middle. So you can see that the middle is the center of the belt. This is going to be sewn on anyway, so we need to get the placement very well. So I will start with the center. This is my center here. You can see I ironed it, I have a fold there. And I place it on the middle, and I'll measure 8 inches from the base. So I pin it down at 8 inches. Exactly 8 inches from the base. So I'll pin those 2 points down first. So I'll now begin to pin it towards the front. Keep on measuring 8 inches from the base. You can decide to, put in any effect you like. You can put in a pocket, you can put in anything, just to give it some character, give it some styling. Decided to use a belt. So we'll just stop shortly before my princess cut line. So since I've pinned the base, I'll just pin the top also. I made it have an arrowhead shape. You can decide to make it a box shape or a curved edge, whichever one you desire. So I've done this side now, I'll just pin the other side too. You can see that I have to shift it slightly, just gently, not much. Because what we're trying to achieve is equidistance. So we may need to shift it a little so that it corresponds with the other side. Okay, you've been able to achieve the equidistance. So I'll pin up the rest now. We'll now go back to the machine and go and sew. So we'll now begin to top stitch on the belt there. I'll top stitch round and give it a double stitch. Slow and steady wins the race, so just take it bit by bit so that you will get a very neat and nice line. So we're done with that line. We'll give it a double stitch. That one should be faster because they're just trying to follow the line you've already sewn. So now we have sewn our belt on top of our jacket. You can see the styling looks really nice. We're going to put a button there to give it some nice effects later on. So we'll start by sewing the base. You know, we've already trimmed our lining. So we'll take the base, pin it together. You know, we've trimmed 1 inch from it, so it's shorter than the actual fabric, shorter than the body. I'm just going to pull it in when we're done. I'll pin the other side first, and I'll begin to work it towards the middle. And when sewing your linings together, I'm talking about the pieces, try not to sew up to 1/2 inch because we want our lining to be slightly bigger than the main body. That will help keep it in properly. Now, if it's very tight, if the lining is smaller than the main body, you find out that it will be tugging at the main fabric. So it's always better for the lining to be slightly larger. And if you take a look at this, you find out it's just slightly larger. That will help to keep the shape of the main body together rather than tugging at it. So for the seams of the lining, what I just sewed was like 3/8 of an inch, thereabouts. So I will stitch the base. I'll stitch it 1/4 of an inch. I'll top stitch on the lining. So now that we've top stitched the base, the next thing we'll do will be to pin it up together this way. Now you can see what has happened here. That the line has pulled up the fabric from underneath. You can see that. So now I'm going to stitch this edge now, which is the edge of my lapel. I'll stitch that down. Now, I'll stitch very close to the edge, and we're now going to top stitch. Now, like I told you, we're going to have the lapel folding over to the front from the inside. Now, the part that folds over to the front is now become the right side. So we're going to top stitch on the main body on that portion, while the rest will top stitch on the lining. I'll show you when I'm doing that. Now at this point where we can see a defined curve here, you can see that I will notch that point to that point there. Because now what I want to do is I want to top stitch on the main body from here down, and I will now switch to the other side. Let me first remove this excess here. Now I'm going to put a pin on this side so that I would know when I get to that point where exactly I am. That's just to mark out. That's just to mark out where the pin will be, where the slash is. So see what I'm going to do now. This is the main body. This is the lining. This is the part that will show on the lapel when we iron it out. So I'm going to top stitch on the main body here up to that slash there. And I will now switch to the other side. So I top stitch up to that point, and I'll immediately tilt the seam allowance towards the lining at that point where the pin is. Okay, I lift it up, and I'll tilt the seam allowance under the lining. Now begin to stitch it. I switch to the lining now. And now begin to stitch till I get to the end, or at least as close as possible to the end. Okay, yeah. So at this point I switched, so I'm going to trim off the excess thread there. I'll show you what we did on the other side. Now you can see what we have done. We just switched this to this side and started stitching. We were stitching here before, then we now switched to this other side. You can see that. Now that's just to ensure that by the time we iron it, this place stays in very well, so that we don't see any rough side, we don't see any wrong side flowing over to the right side. When we get to this point, it switches, so that by the time you turn this over, this is not following it anyhow. You can just iron it and then you have a smooth switch there. Let's do the second side like that. Okay. So I will now slash that point. And put a pin there so that I will know where it gets to. Now I'll begin to top stitch. Top stitch on the main body from the lapel to the slash. This is where my pin is, so I'm getting ready to switch. So I switch to the other side. Use my fingers to take it to the other side, yeah. So I'll cut off the thread here. I'll remove the pin. You can see we switched it here. So I'll turn it to the right side. Use my scissors to poke it out. So now that we've done that, so you can see what happens. Time you top stitch it, it keeps it in. It doesn't roll over to the other side. Just iron it like that. So now we're going to measure the neckline, after which we will look at how to make our collar, fix our collar, and then fix our sleeves. So I'm going to take the sleeves now and begin to sew it. I'll pin this first so that I can know the measurement of my neckline. So the excess here, just fold it in and pin it down. So now I want to measure what the neckline is. We need that to work out our collar pattern. So I'll place my tape rule like this, ensuring that the head of the tape rule is resting on the edge of the material, this way. Okay, so what I have here is 22.5 inches. Now, once I have that, I would now know what I would decide to have as my lapel edge. I could decide to use 1 inch, 1.5, or 2 inches. For this project, we'll use 2 inches. We'll see how that looks like. We'll try out the 1.5 if it looks nice. We can even use 1/3. Maybe we should use 1/3 inches. That's in between 1.5 and 2, so it's just fine. You can use whatever size you want to use for the lapel edge. What I mean is the amount of space you want to leave at the edge, it should be the same with the edge of your collar, because that's what will give it equidistance. Now we're making a sharp edge collar, we're not making a curved collar. So if you're making a curved edge collar, you know that it's going to be curved. Well, this lapel will be curved and the collar also will be curved, but this is a sharp edge collar, so we're not doing that today. So now that I've done that's 22.5, I'll subtract 3.5 inches. I want to use 1/3 inches for the lapel edge. So I'll subtract 3.5 inches, and what I will be left with is, I'll be left with 19 inches. Yes, because 19 inches plus 3.5 inches gives me 22.5 inches. So my collar is going to be 19 inches long for this edge, leaving 1/3 at each edge. Now before we go to the board, let's sew our sleeves so that we have all of these done before we go to the board. For my sleeve edge, I'm going to trim off 1/2 inch from the lining. So I'll trim off 1/2 inch. Because we've trimmed it off, it will be slightly longer, so pin it here and then pinch it somewhere in the middle. Just pinch it gently because it's slightly larger. Just a very slight pinch. So I'll stitch 1/4 at the base. top stitch on the lining. Okay, so we'll sew the underneath. Make sure you match the lines. Notch underneath here. So we've already sewn our sleeves. We're now going to iron it. So before we go to the board, I'll go and iron this. Just smoothen it out like we did for our simple blouse with princess cut. Just iron it out and smoothen it. Then we'll meet at the board. So I'll just smoothen this down like this. Iron it. So you iron this in like this. And this edge, you press it this way. So you can see that by the time you iron this out, it's neat and tidy. Let's do the other side. So we've ironed that. You just press it on top again. So iron the sleeves. So now that we've made our sleeves, we've ironed our sleeves, we'll now go to the board and see how we'll make our collar. So we've already measured the neckline of our jacket and we found that it's 22.5 inches. So I said, first of all, we have to decide what your lapel edge would be. And we're choosing to use 1¾ inches. We could use as much as 2 inches or even 2½. It really depends on the style that you want to come up with. You can use as little as 1 inch or 1½ inches, but we'll just hold the middle line. We'll use 1¾ inch. So that means if I'm using 1¾ inch both sides, if I add that together, that will give me 3½ inches. That's 1¾ plus 1¾ is 3½ inches. So I subtract 3½ inches, and what I get is 19 inches. And that is the length of my collar. That's the total length of the collar. Now, I would now, first of all, divide this into two because I want to fold my paper into two, and I'm going to curve it out. So, but because I need to fold my paper, I need to divide this into two. This will give me 9½ inches. That's 9½ inches, because 19 divided by 2 is 9½ inches. Now, this is my fold. Now, this is the length, actually. We haven't talked about the height. Now, the height shouldn't really be more than 4 inches. You can use less than that. You can use 3½. You can use, you know, maybe 3¼ but really shouldn't go beyond 4 inches. So the height will be 4 inches. So we need to cut out a strip that is 19 inches by 4 inches. Now there's something about the collar we're making that's really going to be curved at a particular point. So because of that curve, we need to reduce this 9½ by 1 or by 3/4, as the case may be, but we're going to reduce it by 1 to curve it out. So by the time we're done with curving it out, we will now check the measurement to be sure that we have 9½ or 19 inches, as the case may be. So this is my strip. I'll subtract 1 here, and that will give me 8½. That's just to draft out the pattern. So this is my strip. I need to cut out a strip that is, first of all, 17 inches by 4 inches. I fold that into two. This is the fold. So the first thing I do will be to come to this edge. This is 4 inches, so don't forget. I come to this edge and measure 1 inch inward, like that. I'll now take my tape rule on the piece of paper and mark out where the length of my lapel edge, we have chosen 1¾ so I'll measure that out to check where that rests on the paper. So maybe this is where it gets to. I'll now slant it down there, and I'll curve this, you know, towards the midpoint or shortly after the midpoint. You can see that. Now I'll come to the middle here and measure 1 inch down and curve this to this point here. So this is the color how it is. I will now take my tape rule after I'm done and measure it to be sure it will give me 9½ inches, and that's all we're really looking for. But because of the curve, if we had used 9½ inches, it will be longer than what you really want. So now that we've done our pattern, so let's go to the table and now draft it out, cut it out, iron it, and then fix it. So let's go to the table. We'll take our paper and we'll fold it into two, this way. You can decide to cut out a strip of 4 inches by 17 inches, or you could just decide to work it out as I'm about to work it out now. So I'll measure 4 inches. Draw the line. Okay, I'll now measure out the 8½ inches. So I'll now measure out 1 inch on top here. Now check where my 1/3 lands. That's my 1/3 here. So after that, I will now curve it. I'll curve it like that. Now measure my 1 inch here. Good. So we'll now check this measurement to be sure that this will give us, don't forget that the measurement we're looking for is 19 inches. And if you divide that into 2, that's 9.5 inches. So I'm going to check that out here at the base, just to be sure. This is almost 19.5 inches. This is supposed to be 9.5. So we'll just add it to increase it, just gently, like I told you. It's better to be short so that you don't get it too long. And just extend it by 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so let's check it again. It's 9.5 inches now. And I will check the lapel edge to be sure it's okay. This is supposed to be 1/3. So we're cool with that. So you pin it in place and cut it out. So what you can do is that you can actually, instead of subtracting 1 inch, you can subtract 3/4 inch. That means that you cut out a piece that's 8/3 of an inch. That will give you 8/3 of an inch. Okay, so what we have here is Yeah, 9.5. So I'm going to cut out this piece with, I'm going to use it to cut out my collar stain. Okay, now we've cut it out. What we'll do next will be to iron it on top of our fabric, and then we'll meet at the machine to sew it. So now we have ironed it out on our fabric, and we have cut out our seam allowance around it, and we have also cut another piece that will be underneath it like that. So I place them together, and I'm going to sew the top alone for now. I'll make sure that I sew a little bit away from the collar, so just slightly away, like 1 millimeter away from it. So I will notch it all the way. Okay, I'll remove the pins. Now top stitch on the piece that's underneath the collar. So I just cut that off there. So I'll now turn this, stitch this one down properly. Yeah. So I'll now take this part and turn it down this way and sew off this place. You can see that it's already been sewn down here. You can see that here. So I'll now sew this place. That's the edge of the collar. Sew by the side. Remove the excess. Remove the excess, trim it off like that. And we turn to the right side. Use the edge of your scissors. Oops, I did that too much, so I have to stitch that back That's what happens if you poke it out too much. So, yeah. So I have to be gentler when I'm doing that the next time. Just turn it gently. You can use your finger. There's another way to just do that, and then you get it out that way. Don't see that? So I'll just use my pins to hold it down. You can actually tack that if you want, or iron it out before pinning it. So I'm pinning it there. So we'll keep on pinning that way. This is to keep the this is to keep the collar in place. So you can see that because of the way we pinned it, we have a little excess coming out from underneath it. Good. So I'll trim that little excess off. That's a slight excess. It's not so much. Okay, so after trimming that, I'll now check the edges to be sure that it's equal, because you don't want one looking longer. This looks slightly longer, so I'll trim a little bit off that, because 1/8 can make a huge difference in the way a color looks. So trim that down. Check it, take a look at it again. Yeah, it's equal. So once I've done that, okay, that's giving us what we want. So I'll get the midpoint. So this place I have notched now is my midpoint. So now we've pinned this up like this, and we've gotten the midpoint. So the next thing is that we'll get the midpoint of the neckline too. Well, most times we always assume that the line at the back should be the midpoint, but you know, at times due to a lot of shifting and sewing and stuff like that, might not necessarily be the midpoint. So you need to place this together at the two. Place the two edges together, then now begin to take it to the back till we get to the midpoint. Just like I told you, just a slight shift, you see that? Very slight, not much. But like I always say, 1/8 of an inch makes a whole lot of difference. You can see that this is the middle, and this is where my center is. It's just like 1/8 of an inch difference. So I need to use that point as my midpoint. You can see that this is where my notch rests, just like 1/8 away. It doesn't matter. Just ensure that you get it as accurate as possible. So I'm going to turn the jacket back to the wrong side because of the way we're going to sew it. We need to sew it. We need to insert the collar and sew it in. So we'll turn it back to the right side, to the wrong side. We're almost done. So this is my midpoint here. I have marked. You can see it here. This is how it's going to be. The collar is going to sit this way. This is how it's going to sit all along the edge. So you need to understand that. So this is how we're going to place it. The side that doesn't have collar, say, would be facing the back this way. So we pin it there. So once we pin the middle, we now begin to pin it all the way to the sides. So what I need to do is to ensure that I get this edge equidistant. Okay, I'm just trying to ensure that it comes out equal by the time I finish sewing it. So I pin it in place to be sure. I'm trying to get from this edge 1/3 of an inch. I'm getting from here, I've got my 1/3 here. So I go right away to ensure the same at the other side. This is how it will be folded. Okay. I've gotten it equal now. So now pin it in place. For whatever you're doing, equidistance is very important because you don't want one side looking bigger than the other side. That won't look professional enough. So now I'm going to stitch it down first, so that I can remove all the pins and then pin it back. Okay, so now I can remove my pins and pin it up properly. So now take all these edges and pin them up properly. So now we can now stitch it once we're done with pinning. So I will now pinch this, pin it in place. Okay, now we can sew. I'm going to stitch 1/4 of an inch. So now that we've done this, we've sewn it all round the neckline. We'll remove the excess that's there. Remove the excess, the bulk, and then we will notch it all through the neckline. So we're going to turn it back to the right side. We're going to turn it through our armhole. You can see it's the same. So we have sewn the edges now. You can see the distance. They need to be the same. Now one more thing we're going to do will be to top stitch together. This, now you can see that this is looking bulky here. Not really bulky, just that it's moving and shifting. So we need to top stitch it down so that it doesn't move around and it rests well. So I'm going to pull it very well. I'm top stitching both layers together. That's the body and the lining. So I'll pin that there. I'll start from like 1.5 inches from the edge of the shoulder and end like 1.5 inches after the edge of the shoulder. So I'm pulling it so that there are no folds. You can iron that out soon so that you're sure of that. So I'll start like 1.5 inches before the shoulder here. Let me make it 2 inches. Stop around 2 inches there. So moving all the excess threads around there. Okay. So now we've sewn it right now. Next thing we're going to do will be to pin our armhole. But before we do that, we need to first of all check to trim off a little. I'll pin the other one to determine what I'm going to trim off. Now that's going to, we need to trim off a little there. For the back, you need to check the level where the line is. Make sure that one is not shorter than the other. I'll turn to the wrong side so I can see what I'm trimming very well. You can see I need to take some part of that off. So I'll check the back. Okay, let's trim the second sleeve, the armhole. Okay, so we've trimmed it now. The two sleeves are identical. I'll now check the arm side. That's the measurement of the armhole. Because at times it may be different for each armhole. So we start from the armhole here, from the armpit region. This is like 19¾ Let me check the second armhole. I have almost about the same thing, but this is like 19½. So we'll use 19¾ because it's bigger of the two. So we'll use that as the measurement of what we want to do. I'll pick my sleeves, put that here, and shoulder pad. Now, this can be naked shoulder pads. It doesn't really have to be covered up with fabric because we're going to insert it into the shoulder. So I'm going to trim it around. I don't need it to be too big, I just need it to be small. So let me see, let me check whether it's just fine. I'll remove the pins at this point here. Okay, I think it's just fine. Can sit there. So you put that in halfway there and you pin it back. Pin my shoulder pad here. I'll put it on the other side. Take my shoulder pad. Pin it back. So now we put our shoulder pads in. You can see that it's not really big, it's just a very small shoulder pad. You can decide to do without it if you don't want shoulder pads. So I'm now going to ease in my sleeve. Now if you check what is here, what we're using is 9¾ inches. Now we have a little excess here. We're going to ease that in. So I'm going to start by running a few gather stitches. I'm not going to stitch my lining together with it yet. I'll just start from somewhere here. Okay. Do the same on the other side. So I'll now pick one of the strands of thread and pull this as a slight gather, just slight, not much. You can see, you can barely see it. Let me try this on the edge. It's a little tight there. Okay, this one is better. You can see, you can hardly see the gathers. It's just something that gives it a slight ease. So I'm now going to reduce it to slight, very slight. I'm going to measure around till I get 19 3/4. I have 19, so I need to reduce it. Just to give it that, you know, can you see that very slight puff? It's called easing in. Let me leave it at 19.5. So now I'm going to pull this and check. I'll measure it. You can see I'm placing my tape rule on the line of sewing. What I have is almost 19.5, so I'll just release it gently. You can see how it's just showing a slight puff there. No, I'll leave it at that. Okay. I'll now pick my body, the body of the jacket, fold it to the wrong side, take my sleeve. Now one thing we need to take note of is that when we want to fix the sleeve for the jacket, like I told you, they were just observing a few rules from making the suit, so it's not like as if it's a full suit. One of the things that you notice when you're wearing a jacket is that the sleeves are tilted forward gently. So to just try to achieve that, we're going to move the point of our shoulder like half an inch backwards, so that by the time I fix my sleeve, I have my hand moving gently like this. That's just the whole idea. So I'm going to place, instead of using this as the center, I would place it half inch backwards, so that my sleeve will tilt gently to the front. So this is the point I'll use. I'll start pinning my sleeve there. So this is the back. So I just take my mark and take it backwards slightly. That's about ½ inch backwards. So once I've pinned that, I can now begin to pin the other parts. Pin here. So you can see that it just fits snugly. So I've pinned that inside this armhole now. So I'll pin the second sleeve into the armhole. Forget that we tilt it by ½ inch backward. This is my back, so I'm going to put it here. Okay. So I've pinned it now. I can begin to sew. So I'm sewing slightly beneath that line, slightly below the line. So now we've sewn the sleeve. Let's check round to be sure everything is okay. Let's sew the second sleeve. Be careful not to allow folds to, to take place as you're sewing. So we finished sewing the two armholes now. So we'll check it to see how it looks like. You can see that the slight puff that we left there, just to create space for the shoulder part. So remove the pins. Sure that there are no folds. You can see how this just rounds up nicely. It's because we put the little easing in that we put in. That's what makes it just, look slightly rounded like that. So I'll just take this in, my lining, turn it back to the wrong side. So we're going to use the lining to turn it over like that and hem it down. I'm going to start with this point here. Remember that we have moved it ½ inch backwards. So I'll just be pinning all the way around now. Don't forget that we eased it in gently, so we may need to pleat at a few points. Just put this two like that and pin it down, just to create some fullness at that point. You want to erase every rough edge as much as possible. So we've pinned this one. Let's pin the second side. Okay, so we have pinned it round now. You can see that we're taking care of all the rough edges. All the rough edges have been taken care of. So we'll pick our needle now and begin to hem. So we're going to use overcasting to hem it. We're not doing slip hemming. You can also decide to do slip hemming, but we're not doing slip hemming. All we just need to be doing is taking it over like that, every half an inch. So almost done with the second sleeve. Okay, so now we have finished our jacket. What remains are the buttons. We're going to mark out the positions of our buttons. We can put this here and do that. Since there are not many buttons anyway, so we can actually mark them here. Now, because this is a female outfit, it's going to be right over left. That means this is the right-hand side over the left. So I pin that here. I can get the position of my button. Now I'm using this lovely big button, very imposing button. I'm also going to put that here, sew it up here. You can see how it looks really cute. So I need to first of all measure out my button and know what the size is. You can see that this is like slightly above an inch, just about an inch. No, this is about 1/1/8, fine. So my buttonhole will be 1/1/8 plus another 1/8, and that will be 1/1/4. I'm going to use, it's a big button, so that means we need a bigger buttonhole. So I'm just going to do this because I only want to use like 2 or 3 buttons here. I get this pinned this way, make sure that this is equal. Once I've gotten that equal, I now take this and place it on top of the other so that I can get it like that. Okay, and I'll just pin it one more time there. Okay, I'll now begin to mark out my my buttons. Let me put my first button here, about 1/4 of an inch. Let me see that. Put it here. So that's my first position of my button. 1/2 inch away from the edge. I'll make it 1/1/8 instead of 1/1/4. Let's work with that. Next one, I will measure out 2 1/4 of an inch. Final one, 2 1/4 of an inch. Good, 2 1/4 inches. I'll measure it like that. So you can see that faintly there. So we have 1, 2, 3. Then we put a button here and we put a button on the other side. So let's do our buttonholes. After which we will fix our buttons. So set it. Let's do the third one, the third and final buttonhole. Okay, so we've done our 3 buttonholes. We'll now cut through it. Just match them like that. Can use a blade or seam ripper. Then cut a little. Now cut the rest. Remove all the excess threads. Okay, fine. Let's do the second one. Remove all the threads. Because the fabric is a fraying type, so you need to get rid of all the excess threads, or else you won't really enjoy the buttonhole. Okay, done the second one. The third one. Okay, so take it back, lay it on top of one another again, and then we'll now get the placements of the buttons. So I'll mark the position of the buttons. So we've gotten the position of our buttons now. So what we're going to sew it now. So this is the position of our buttons here. Now let's begin to sew. Now because we have a button that has 4 holes, we're going to sew in a cross direction. That means it's going to look like an X. So we tighten it. So we're on the last button now. So now we're done. I'll iron it out and then I'll try it on for you to see. So what about this? I'm sure you like what you're seeing. We have actually finished making our lady's jacket. I'm going to model it for you to see. And it's not as difficult as it looks, you know, because when you put in all that effort, you will surely come out with results. So why don't you grab your drafting